Hi, everyone. This is Mark. Welcome to our seventh lecture in Politics of Development. This one is going to be focused on foreign aid and its discontents. One of the chapters that we had for today is by a scholar, Maurits van der Dien. It's from a book that came out with Cambridge University Press a little while ago, looking at the popularity contest of recipients of aid. Sometimes what Dambisa Moyo, the other scholar whose work we read for today's class, refers to as the beauty contests. And so for Maurits van der Dien, he's looking at 4 European countries and what determines where their foreign aid goes. And so it's a study on the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and Norway. One of the acronyms that you see in this chapter is DAC, and that could mean a lot of different things, different institutions. But what he is referring to is the Development Assistance Committee, which constitutes the donors of foreign aid within the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. So they are the advanced liberal democracies that provide bilateral foreign aid assistance to countries in the global south. So DAC is the group of countries that do that, which is most of the countries of the OECD, including Canada. And so there are a number of running themes. One thing that you'll really note about this chapter is that it does present to you some statistics. Some of it is descriptive statistics, where it's showing you the percent of the net foreign aid that is being sent to different recipient countries, and gives you breakdowns of percentages of where it's going. It also provides you some inferential statistics as well. And this is where it gets a bit more sophisticated and complicated. It's those regression tables that the author presents you with. And you don't have to know the formula that he presents. You don't have to be able to interpret the inferential statistics for any of the tests or for anything in this class. But it is a really good example of some traditional political science. And so if you are reading this and it gets to the inferential statistics and you're not really following it too well, that's okay for this course. It's not going to hold you back. But it is one of those things where you really should think about, okay, what don't I understand? And then either sign up for a social sciences research methods course potentially, or maybe think about doing a little bit of statistics courses on the side, because a lot of political science, especially as it's done in the United States, it really looks a lot like this chapter is from this book from Cambridge University Press. And he has a critique too of a lot of this quantitative research in political science, as you may have noted, that he says that often these quantitative statistical studies offer the most tepid of conclusions, such as how it turns out when it comes to the selection of recipient countries of foreign aid, that it's informed both by the donor country as well as the recipient country, which is not a surprising insight whatsoever. And so some of these articles can traditionally be very, very intuitive and not offer profound insights. But hopefully you got some insights on the foreign aid selection for the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and Norway. And a few themes probably stand out to you. One really notable one is that for the first few decades of bilateral foreign aid assistance, so this is foreign aid that countries give to other countries in the global south that doesn't go through the World Bank or the IMF or international financial institutions. It noted that former and even at the time present colonies received most of the aid during the first half of official development assistance. In some cases, it was more like 90% or 95% of the foreign aid. And so the colonial era was really the focus and the priority when it came to these countries and the aid that it was delivering, with the exception being of Norway, which doesn't have these notable foreign colonies beyond the region of Norway and the many islands. Some of them are vast. I consider the Belgian Congo, which Belgium under King Leopold II largely became the master of following the Congress of Berlin in the late 19th century. King Leopold II called it the Congo Free State, where he promised to prohibit slavery in the arms trade and would establish these scientific associations to improve the lives of the Congolese there, when it in fact was a brutal slave state, one of the most horrendous examples of European colonialism that occurred during the 19th century or really ever. In fact, in a book by Adam Hochschild called King Leopold's Ghost, Hochschild even suggests to the reader that when we think about the greatest monsters of the modern world, we think of Hitler and Stalin, and rightfully so. But he even says that the monstrosities done in the Belgian Congo are such that really we probably should even put King Leopold in that pantheon of global terror of our modern world. The Belgian Congo is 80 times the size of Belgium, more than twice the size of the combined geographies of France and Germany. This is a huge part of sub-Saharan Africa. And the Belgians, they controlled the Congo as well as Rwanda and Burundi. And so much of what in sub-Saharan Africa is called the Great Lakes region. One other notable thing that Moritz tells us is that European countries prioritized Africa much more than non-European countries. And so a lot of non-European countries, so think of Japan as well as the United States and Canada, countries that have delivered sizable amounts of foreign aid to Africa, right, as Dambisa Moyo notes. But they also prioritized a lot of other regions around the world. Now, the United States provided around $500 million to South Korea after the Korean War, and probably somewhere around $13.5 billion throughout much of the Cold War period to South Korea. So the US, it prioritized Africa as well as Asia and also South America and Latin America at times, whereas the Europeans, a lot of their focus was really on Africa. And aid frames are used to determine which countries are prioritized. And so our scholar here presents us with a bit of a typology on the different motivating factors on why aid is sent to certain recipient countries at certain times. And he arranges them thematically, though, in an overlapping thematic way, where influence and importance in the UN can inform different frames of reference. And we'll go over some of those examples with our 4 European countries. One important note that he makes is that it's easier to be added as a recipient country than taken off. And so, like so many aspects of political institutions, there's a path dependency at play. And so once you are added as a recipient country, you are often there for an extended period of time. The Netherlands and Norway, Netherlands shorthand is often as NED. For those of you who are wondering why is it NED and not NET or something, it's because it's Nederlands. I lived in the Netherlands for a little while back in the old days when I was doing my PhD. And so the Netherlands, the Nederlands, the Nederlanders, them and the Norwegians are more motivated by humanitarian concerns compared to the cases of Belgium and Italy, where we see more discernible economic interests in forming foreign aid. They also note that political parties rarely mattered when it came to decisions on foreign aid, at least in those four cases. And this is an insight that comes from comparative politics, but also an insight that maybe is not entirely generalizable across all of the DAC countries of the OECD. It's been noted before that that's not as true for Canadian official development assistance. And so the Conservatives, especially during the Prime Minister Harper years, they really prioritized South America and other countries that were not as destitute as many countries in sub-Saharan Africa are. They really prioritized South American countries, and it's sometimes observed that Liberal Party governments are more likely to take an interest in sub-Saharan Africa. So it applies to at least three of those four countries, but as we'll note in a minute, it doesn't exactly apply to Belgium. The author notes that humanitarian or enlightened self-interest frames, so when recipients are chosen out of a frame of humanitarian assistance or what he refers to as an enlightened self-interest. And this is where he doesn't want to call it altruism, but right, he's thinking something similar to an altruistic attempt to try to improve the living conditions in a country. He says that when those frames inform aid recipients, then it usually results in the administration of aid in a much faster way to the public than when other frames, such as the power frame, are more closely associated with how it is that recipient countries are picked. Another thing that's really vital is that countries in the global south that are major sources of imports into these Western countries do tend to receive less aid. So there is this general sentiment found in these four cases, and probably a lot of other cases, where if a country is running a trade surplus with them, even if they're impoverished and lower middle income, even lower income, then the donor countries of the DAC, they're not going to be as interested in providing developmental assistance. The reputation, though, of the reputation frame, so when a country wants to select recipient countries so that their reputation will be more esteemed and heightened, that is often driven by the choices of other DAC members. So countries in the OECD, the advanced liberal democracies, they look at what the United States is doing, or France or Germany, or the United Kingdom, and they'll sometimes follow their lead as a way to enhance their reputation, to say, hey, you're donating X number of dollars into this project. Let us be a part of it. We'll have a partnership of sorts. And so it's a way to work together. It's sometimes said that so much of the prioritization of Afghanistan in the period between the fall of the Taliban until the US withdrawal and the Taliban taking over the country again, it was so much aid came into that country, partly out of the security fears of a resurgent Taliban that could support global jihadist movements like Al-Qaeda, but also because it was a way to get into the good favors of the United States, to follow their lead and to send a large amount of their aid budget into Afghanistan. The Netherlands and Norway tend to prefer democratic recipients, but that was not universally the case. It's not as obvious with Belgium or with Italy. Italy is, for instance, had been supplying a lot of foreign aid to countries in North Africa with extraordinarily repressive human rights records, such as Gaddafi's Libya, for instance. We'll start off with Belgium. In the background, you can see the guild houses of Belgium, and you'll note that the Zaire, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, takes up an enormous amount of Belgium's foreign aid. if you add in their other Great Lakes region, sub-Saharan African colonies, that it was about 90% of foreign aid until the late 1960s. Zaire, that was the old name of the DRC before the invasion of Rwanda into Zaire. It was called the First Congo War, where they overthrew the dictator Mobutu and ended up installing a new regime under Laurent Desire Kabila. And then they changed the name to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Of course, it would not be, it was not a democracy under Mobutu, it was a dictatorship, and was not established as a democracy after the Rwandan Patriotic Front overthrew the government in Kinshasa. And Zaire was receiving no less than 50% of Belgium's foreign aid. It was still nearly 40% as late as 1980. And part of it came from an obligation that the Belgian parliament understood they had to the people of the Congo, right? That there was a lot of the horror, to quote Joseph Conrad in The Heart of Darkness, which is loosely based on the Belgian Congo and echoed in the movie Apocalypse Now. The horror, right, that was done in the Congo was not fully known for a long time. It was eventually, as missionaries and others revealed the grandiose atrocities committed in the Congo Free State, then there was the push to take the colony away from the King Leopold II, who basically just ruled it as a tyrant, took it away. And it wasn't until later, especially after World War II, a few years after World War II, where some Belgian parliamentarians spent time in Congo when it was still technically a colony and helped reveal to the Belgian public and to much of the world just how extraordinarily brutal these conditions really were. And so there was a real sense of how the Belgians owed something to the Congolese. But it was always a mix of economic interest as well, right? Zaire, or today's DRC, it is still one of the most important providers of a number of mineral resources. Coltan comes to mind, which is so important for computer screens and touch screens. Cobalt is just so fundamentally important for electric vehicle battery production. It has an enormous amount of gold, of tin, of so many others. And one thing that Maurits notes is that Zaire or Congo, it's attractive to Belgium on a lot of levels. Yeah, there's a sense of obligation, but there's also an economic interest at stake there. And because of the size of the Congo as one of the largest countries in Africa, then it is also going to increase the stature and reputation of Belgium as a major lender, provider of aid to the Congo. It's also why Latin America becomes important, and what the Belgians seem to be trying to do, according to Maurits over time, is that they're trying to develop export markets. So markets where Belgium can export goods and services to. And one thing that Maurits notes is that once a global South country begins to receive Belgian imports, then often that will turn off the aid tap and Belgium will turn its attention somewhere else. So they're trying to develop new export markets. Once they establish it, then that's a reason why they'll shift resources somewhere else. And it is the one case where party politics does seem to matter. Right? It is the politics of ethnicity and of identity. Belgium is divided between the Flemish in the north and Wallonia in the south. Brussels is a French-speaking city, but is an an enclave in Flanders, right, in the Flemish area of the country, where it's in the South Wallonia, where it's primarily French. And historically, Belgian politics and the Belgian economic system had been largely dominated by the Walloon, the French-speaking part of the country, and the Flemish had been left largely isolated from opportunities and from influence. It's different now, though. Today, I would say that the Flemish have a pretty strong economy, and it's in Wallonia, the French parts of Belgium in the south, where they really lost a lot of their manufacturing, and there's, I think, more economic hardship happening there. But one of the issues of an ethnic group that is isolated from power and influence is that they want to create their own international personality and have an effect on foreign policy, both of the national governments, but also independently. Right? There's all kinds of Flemish secessionist parties throughout Flanders that see more in common, for instance, with the Netherlands than they do with Brussels. And so what does emerge is that the Flemish are able to influence Brussels enough to target some other countries that are significant to the Netherlands. And Indonesia, a former colony of the Netherlands, is the one that really took on greater significance. The obligation to Zaire did begin to erode throughout the 1980s and certainly into the 1980s, certainly into the 1990s, where it begins to drop to below 10%. And this is largely because of the Mobutu regime, which was one of the most corrupt regimes in the entire world, where Mobutu had personally stolen somewhere around $10 million is sometimes talked about. Some maybe when you consider the amount that he took from international financial institutions and from the exploitation of the land and the labor of the Congolese, it's probably many, many more, billions more, and dispersed as bribes. This resulted in the Belgians being less eager to fund the Mobutu regime. And humanitarianism and enlightened self-interest became much more important. And it diversified. At one point, 90% of the aid went to 3 countries. By the mid-1990s, 114 countries were receiving foreign aid assistance from Belgium. Italy is another one of these cases. You can see the statue of Machiavelli from Florence in the background here. And Maurits notes that these decisions on foreign aid, they lacked much public inquiry and parliamentary discussion for a really long time. National government had a lot of leeway in how they were deciding aid was going to be administered. And this is also kind of in tension with how he opens this chapter, where he says that nothing, no public policy will create as much debate as foreign aid will. And well, for many decades in Italy, foreign aid was not really a serious issue at all. The emphasis was on Italy's own neighborhood, though on the other side of the Mediterranean, such as Egypt and Libya, but also in Somalia and Ethiopia and Argentina. Somalia and Ethiopia are important in the Italian context because of the colonial link there, when the fascist government of Benito Mussolini invaded Abyssinia and had occupied Ethiopia for a really significant period of time during the interwar years in World War II. And Argentina is important for Italian foreign aid because of the Italian diaspora that moved to Argentina. Yugoslavia was the country close to Italy on Italy's border that was particularly important. Instead, it was from both a mix of the wealth frame because of how much trade Italy did with Yugoslavia, but also for security purposes. Now, there's concerns even back during the days of the Cold War about a potential collapse of the Tito regime. Right? Tito, the socialist head of Yugoslavia, clearly one of the most diverse countries in the world with some of the most intense cleavages, which Tito is able to keep under wraps for a number of decades, though at the time of the Cold War, it was not really clear that he would be able to do it. And Western governments weren't really eager to see Tito's rule fail compared to most socialist governments, because Tito did have certain independence from the Soviet Union that he was able to earn from Stalin. They prioritized the most visible of the problem states. So countries, by problem states, Maurits means countries dealing with some really extreme levels of poverty and hardships in their quality of life. But the most visible ones, such as Tanzania or Sudan, visible because of the conflict, Angola, visible as a mix because of the conflict there. This is one of the theaters of the Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans, but also because of the high amount of oil that Angola exports. Tanzania is a really visible one. Some of you who have been on safaris would know that it is a major destination to see, the big animals of Africa. And so they would target problem states, so really poor states, but they were worried, they were thinking about their reputation. So they were trying to focus on countries that were seen as very visible, either because of international tourism in the case of Tanzania, or because of tension and political fissures like in Sudan and Angola. And they were primarily informed by the economic frame, the wealth frame, more than anything. The Netherlands, and incredibly, Maurits notes that between 1/2 to 2/3 during the early decades of the Cold War went to Suriname, Netherlands Antilles, and Netherlands New Guinea, not Indonesia, right? At times, Indonesia is a very important destination of Dutch aid, but not always. They have a really complicated relationship with Indonesia for a long time. At the end of World War II and the victory against Japan, Indonesian nationalists Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta, they declared their independence in 1945, and the Dutch refused to accept it. And what happens is a horrible, horrible war rages for about 4 years in Indonesia, where the Dutch are not willing to accept the independence of the Indonesians. The Indonesians, they're torn for a lot of different reasons. And so it's a fight for independence, but it's also really a civil war on a lot of fundamental levels. And then when they finally do get their independence, recognized by the Dutch, by the United States, and by the United Nations itself, then Sukarno comes to power as president, and he tells people to go to hell with your aid. And they have a really, really difficult relationship where the Netherlands is often highly vilified by Sukarno in a way that resonates with a lot of Indonesians because of the crimes committed during the colonial era, as well as at the end of World War II by not standing in solidarity with the Indonesians. The power frame is critically important for Dutch foreign aid policy. And so this is about the power of the Netherlands being enhanced based on who the recipients of their aid would be. And so the size of the recipients would be important. So very big countries are seen as enhancing one's power through the DAC commitment. Recipients across continents, so having the idea is like sharing your benevolence across multiple continents would increase your power and your influence. And the recipients that were prioritized by other donors, especially the United States. The Dutch minister Pronk began to prioritize humanitarianism publicly by the mid-1970s. And they also had some really unusual recipients prioritized as well. including socialist governments in Cuba and Jamaica. Cuba even having an alliance with the Soviet Union was still a prioritized one for the Dutch, which was meant to be this symbol of independence by them, that their actions were not dictated by the NATO alliance, and was a way to try to make inroads with socialist governments and with Moscow too. For Norway, the country without much of a colonial history, though there are certainly indigenous people in Norway that had suffered injustices over many, many decades. But for them, the security frame was very, very important at first, right? The vast majority of their aid, almost all of their aid, was headed towards either India or to South Korea, especially after the outbreak of the Korean War. India is highly prioritized because of the war of partition between India and Pakistan. East Africa gets chosen. A number of East African countries are selected by Norway to receive an awful lot of foreign assistance. And it said that there was this enlightened self-interest that led Norway to support liberationist movements in sub-Saharan African countries. And even though it created tensions with some of their NATO allies. And so some of these countries were looking at earning their independence from other European great powers. And it said that Norway was providing humanitarian assistance to them in a way that the European colonial powers probably did not really appreciate. They had a power frame of large, high population states, and they were driven by a reputation as a donor. And what Maurits points out too is that, surprisingly, they're more generous to less populous countries. So they did prioritize, very large, high population states like India, but for some of the smaller countries that were more densely populated, Norway wasn't as interested. It wasn't as generous with their foreign aid to them. Instead, they're more generous to some of those less populous countries outside of like the big countries like India. And Maurits posits that it has something to do with them wanting to show some support to countries that are trying to avoid overpopulation. Okay, and the other reading for today, the one by Maurits van der Deen, it's very much an example of traditional political science, very quantitative, it's statistic. But this other book, Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo, a Zambian economist who worked in international financial institutions. She's worked in Goldman Sachs. She's worked for her home government of Zambia. She's worked for the BBC in journalism. She's a public intellectual who writes books for the general audience. I think you may have caught in the introductory notes that she says that the book's actually written for a certain kind of person. She says it's written for Africans and for those who sincerely want Africa to improve and to develop. So there is that little bit of a condition, but I think any student who signs up for a course on development, genuinely, though they may disagree on what could drive development or what's been holding development back for Africa, think that anyone who would take this course would genuinely and sincerely in their own way want to see people of Africa live better lives. And more recently, I think just a year or two ago, she has been given a life peerage and the title of Baroness in the House of Lords. So it is not a hereditary British aristocratic title, so it won't pass on to any children that she might have with her billionaire husband. But she is a Baroness of the House of Lords because of her phenomenal work. And this book is a tour de force, as so many other ones do. In this book, she poses this thought experiment to you of the Republic of Dongo, an imaginary African country dealing with tremendous quality of life, human development index setbacks from the 1980s on, and to imagine what would happen if this country was told that in 5 years, the aid tap would be turned off. And her position is that you need to create incentives for African governments to be more committed to development. In some ways, it really connects with the work of another developmental economic scholar by the name of Danny Roderick. And in the book, One Economics, Many Recipes, Roderick's basic conclusions is that there's no one path to achieving development, but the one thing that needs to happen is that governments need to be dedicated to development for their public. And Moyo's point is that for many African countries, with some exceptions, that commitment isn't really there. In the forward or preface that you read by Neil Ferguson, and I know Neil Ferguson's a really controversial guy, so don't get mad at me if you know a little bit about him and you really don't like him. I'm not endorsing Neil Ferguson, but Neil Ferguson, makes a pretty powerful point in noting that for so long, the discussion of Africa, especially African development, had been as colonized as Africa itself, where it had been these white men who, such as William Easterly and Jeffrey Sachs and others, who had been the most important voices on African development and maldevelopment. And Moyo's book really changed that, because the most important voice had really become hers, an African woman. Conceptually, in some ways, her ideas that you read in this book are a mix of Adam Smith and social contract theorists. It's a little bit of Adam Smith in the sense that The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's magnum opus from the year of the Declaration of American Independence in 1776, he warns that virtues, that trying to do things for virtuous purposes may actually be leading to tragedy. Right? It's the otherwise known as the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That good intentions alone will not produce policy that is necessarily desirable or what the intended outcome is. Instead, Adam Smith warns that really often public virtue will come from a competition of private vices. And so trying to do things because you think they are right may lead to negative outcomes, whereas sometimes creating an environment of competition, of people acting self-interestedly, will actually lead to more of a virtuous outcome. You get a bit of that with Moyo, right? She tells this one iconic story about how foreign donors wanted to prioritize the delivery of mosquito nets, right? Because of how horrible diseases in the tropics, subtropics, like malaria and dengue fever are a cause of misery in so much of sub-Saharan Africa and harmful to economic productivity. And so what they did was they flooded Africa with these mosquito nets that were made in the West, and it drove out of business the mosquito net makers, who were the ones who were creating a market for these nets. They were the ones creating the supply, and they had a whole family that was dependent on them, often an extended family. And Moyo's point is that, well, if the money could have been made to offset the costs of the mosquito net production internally in Africa, then it would have a much, much different impact. For her, she is really quite frustrated with the amount of money that's come into Africa for very little gain. Right, again and again in those chapters you read, she notes, $1 trillion, right? $1 trillion, you adjust for inflation, that had come to Africa as aid. Probably about $2 trillion in foreign aid globally, but $1 trillion in Africa. Think back to the Marshall Plan. If we adjust for inflation today, that's about $150 billion, $130 billion, right? $1 trillion in Africa with little to show for it. And there's little to show for it because she says aid is with benevolent intentions, but the effects are malevolent. And it's because she has this idea that you create rentier states. So African governments are unlike governments in Western liberal democracies who get revenue from economic activity in the country. Moyo's argument is that by providing aid, like in the case of Dongo, where aid is paying something like 80 to 90% of government revenue in this thought experiment, then government, it gets its money from all of this foreign aid. If it steals it, it doesn't really matter because the aid just keeps pouring in. As Maurits noted, it's once you're an aid recipient, you're not as likely to fall off of it. And the government is not working hard enough to develop domestic industry within the country. Going back to the Declaration of Independence, right? One of the lines is no taxation without representation. Well, you have the demand for representation when you have taxation. If you have a system with no taxation, you don't have the same legitimate demands for democratic reform. And so it undermines the legitimacy of democracy, and it's revolutionary because what it means is that factions within the country will compete with each other in order to, get that foreign aid. She also tells us that, from her perspective, right, that guilt should not inform public policy. That she says that it's Western guilt over colonialism, over ongoing poverty in Africa, which keeps this aid coming in. And she has this powerful argument on why guilt should really not play a role in informing public policy and what governments do around the world. She also takes issue with, I'm pretty sure she actually coins this in the book. I think this is kind of where, if it wasn't coined, it was popularized, the idea of glamour aid. And so this is U2 and Bob Geldof putting on these big rock concerts in order to get more aid to Africa. And she says that, objective, sophisticated, professional, and academic voices can't compete with the electric guitar telling the world that they've got, this moral, guilt-driven duty to provide aid, which she sees as malevolent for African society. She embraces the role of China in Africa, and she thinks that China has the ability to be, friends to African society because it's business for them, right? And they expect returns. And if African countries, are not going to be able to pay back loans to meet interest rates, then it's completely different from the international financial institutions like the World Bank, where they have this concessional lending, where the real rate of return, the debt servicing, it's below market, it's non-existent. It might even be like it might even be negative, right, overall. And she says that this just rewards the corruption. It rewards countries not really making improvements. And she thinks that China has the ability to create greater accountability. And like any person that we read in this course, you don't have to agree with any of it. It's just different perspectives. This is a controversial one too, because a lot of these African countries are not able to pay back the investment that's come into China. And this is not concessional, right? That this is going to require them to get locked into these trade deals, especially in extractive resources, or when it comes to harbors and ports along coasts that are meant to be to the advantage of China. And extremely controversially, you'll see that she even suggests that, well, maybe benevolent dictatorship might not be a bad thing for African development. And she says that she quotes a famous study from the Journal of Democracy that notes that countries that are democracies that are stable don't tend to be stable until they achieve around a middle income status. That lower income countries that are democracies are not necessarily stable ones. And so she's okay and supportive of the idea of a dictatorship that if it would only prioritize development. And so clearly she must be thinking of Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore, probably the greatest example of a 20th century benevolent dictatorship where the state is mobilized towards development. The public policy chapter that I had you read was her idea on a capital solution. So instead of getting bilateral foreign aid, where money comes in, there's no accountability, or World Bank money that comes in with maturities of 35 years, 50 years, without paying a real rate of return, real interest on it. She says that African countries should behave like any country, any other country, or any major corporation. They should have to sell bonds, right, in the bond market. And so what that really means is they sell debt and they use that capital, like they sell these bonds to get capital investments to come in. And then it's on those governments to direct that capital in a way where it's going to improve the economy so much that they can pay investors back and service their debt so they can pay interest rates. And it's a remarkable argument. It's a free market based argument. And it's a way to try to encourage, African countries to act like other countries in the world. But the other motivating idea here is that no company can have a rating unless their home government has a rating. And so this requires African governments to get an international rating, such as with S&P, Standard & Poor, or Moody, or somewhere. And then those companies that exist there, they too can get rated. And then it would be more likely that you would have legitimate investment coming into that country, into private firms. And it's a remarkable idea in this book from 2009. And it's largely how African political economy has unfolded. And she noted that it got started with Ghana doing this and with Gabon doing it. And in March of 2023, just a little while ago, there were actually $143 billion outstanding in African bonds. And so I have some of the biggest ones in 2023 noted here, with Egypt having about almost 40 billion in bonds out there that haven't matured yet. South Africa over 22 billion, Nigeria over 15 billion, Ghana over 13 billion, and Moyo's Zambia with around 3 billion outstanding. And the rate of return, right? Sorry, the index is really quite high as of 2023. This is just October 12th, 2023 from S&P, their African Sovereign Bond Index. 3-year African bond is giving you 6.29%, right, as a return. That's a pretty good return when you compare to other government returns. In Canada, I think it's somewhere around 3% for 3 years. For the United States, I think it's around 4.5%, right? So the rate of return is significantly higher. And so these bonds are in demand. When the original bonds were being put out there, like the Ghanaian one and the one from Gabon, it was oversubscribed by the tune of billions of dollars, right? There was so much demand. There were billions of dollars left on the table of investors wanting to get in on it because this is a major return that they could earn here. There are some issues, though, that come to mind with the capital solution. One is something that Moyo notes herself, where African countries, they're punished to an extent. They have to pay what investors call the Africa premium. And because there is this idea that there is a greater risk and uncertainty in the stability of African governments, that they have to pay a higher rate of return to international investors to make the bonds attractive. And so they're punished by a couple of percentage points, it said. COVID was one of these situations where African countries got plunged into debt, right, as a result of the shutdowns. And while Western countries were able to inject billions or hundreds of billions and over $1 trillion in some cases as stimulus packages, when African countries tried to inject stimulus into their domestic markets to prevent an economic catastrophe like a recession or like a depression, it plunged them into major debts where a number of African countries actually came close to or did default. And some of these bonds, like Jeffrey Sachs, for instance, one of the aforementioned white guys who had colonized the discussion on African development, he, politely disagrees with Moyo on a lot of issues, including this idea of a capital solution. And Jeffrey Sachs worried that it was going to create a new debt trap for Africa. So they sell these bonds, they have to pay this high rate of return, which they would never had done with the World Bank. And are they really going to be able to do it? Are they going to be able to ignite enough economic activity where they could not just pay off the loans or pay off, as the maturity comes due, but can they really pay the rate of return, the interest payments? And Sachs was worried that they wouldn't be able to do it. In 2023, anyway, a lot of these bonds, they're big, right? They're, in the case of the Ghanaian bonds, almost 20% of Ghana's GDP. Senegal's was 14%. Moyo's Zambia was over 10%. So this is a lot of money as bonds relative to their actual GDP. And it's worth noting that due to COVID, Zambia actually did default on its debt in 2020, and in October of 2023 was signing a memorandum of understanding with the International Monetary Fund, though the managing director of the IMF, who we read at the beginning of the course, Georgieva, that she actually announced that the memorandum of understanding had been signed and reached before it actually had, right? When the Zambians were still a little bit uneasy with this, the restructuring of the debt. And most of that debt for Zambia, all right, it is owed to China. And I think in the coming years, it's really going to be a test case on whether Moyo's right, whether the Chinese really are friends of Africa. Here is the cover of The Economist during October of 2023, right? Africa loses faith in democracy. Development is still this long sought after goal by so many people and societies within Africa. And it has been a true struggle, so much so that as this issue in The Economist explores, that's the African outlook is, one that is not so convinced that democratization is going to bear fruit for African development. And I think, just as significantly, their African societies and African governments especially are not so confident that their relationship with the liberal democracies of the world is going to benefit their development, right? So it's a loss of faith domestically about democracy within the countries, but also perhaps a loss of faith in working with other democracies around the world. Okay, next lecture, continuing on this subject a little bit where we leave off, we're going to be looking at the ever expanding BRICS. Have a good one, folks.